All right, everybody, welcome to today's deep dive. And we are tackling a big one today.
Yeah, classic.
How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to unpack some of the, I think, really timeless wisdom in here and hopefully give you some takeaways that you can apply to your own life right away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a book that's been around for almost a century, and it's still so relevant.
Yeah.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is this idea of praise versus criticism. And,
Right.
kind of right out of the gate, Carnegie says criticizing other people, it really tends to backfire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think instinctively we know that nobody wants to be criticized. But one of the things that I thought was so interesting that he points to right away is just how deep this runs. He even tells the story of Al Capone,
Oh, wow.
this notorious gangster, and how Al Capone, deep down, really believed he was a good guy.
It's amazing how powerful self-justification is.
Right.
We all have these narratives that we create to protect our egos and our sense of self. And so when somebody criticizes us, we get defensive because it challenges that whole narrative.
Absolutely. And so Carnegie's advice, instead of criticizing people, is to focus on praise.
Yes.
Look for what people are doing well and call that out, because he says genuine appreciation is such a stronger motivator.
Absolutely. It's so much more effective.
Yeah, and he gives this great example of Charles Schwab, who was this steel tycoon. And Schwab really believed that praising his employees was key to their productivity and their loyalty,
Interesting.
because it made them want to do their best.
Right. It's like nurturing their desire to excel instead of tearing them down.
Yeah.
Simple, but so powerful.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so speaking of simple but powerful, this next analogy, I love it. Carnegie talks about how dogs can teach us how to win friends.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So think about it. Right when a dog greets you, they're so excited to see you, tail wags and barking and jumping up and down.
Pure joy.
Yeah, and they make you feel loved instantly.
Yeah. I think it's because they're masters at showing genuine interest.
Yeah.
They're so present with you. They're not thinking about anything else but you in that moment. And I think that's something we can learn from them, is that instead of trying to be interesting, we should try to be interested.
I love that.
Ask questions, listen attentively,
Yeah.
make people feel like their words matter.
Yeah, and that reminds me of that story, the book about the landscaping inspector who bonded with a client over their shared love of dogs. And he ended up being gifted a puppy just because he took a genuine interest in something that the client was so passionate about.
Exactly. It wasn't about manipulation or trying to get something.
Right.
It was just that authentic connection. And I think, it's amazing how those kind of unexpected rewards come from just having that genuine you-focused approach.
Totally makes you wonder what opportunities we're missing out on by not really listening to the people around us.
Yeah, for sure.
Which brings us to another one of Carnegie's big points, which is the importance of listening. It sounds so obvious.
Right.
But we all love to talk about ourselves, right?
Oh, yeah, I know I do.
Me too. So becoming a really great listener, I think, is a superpower.
Absolutely. And it goes back to that need to feel valued and understood. Even Abraham Lincoln,
Wow.
at the height of the Civil War, he needed somebody to just hear him out.
That's wild.
He summoned a friend to the White House, not for advice, but just to listen to him as he processed his thoughts on emancipation.
Wow, if even Lincoln needed that kind of deep listening,
Yeah,
that really says something
for sure.
about how essential it is.
Right.
Okay, so how do we become better listeners?
Well,
I mean, beyond just paying attention. What
Yeah.
are the actionable steps here?
Carnegie highlights the importance of asking open-ended questions. Not just waiting for your turn to talk, but really engaging with the other person.
Right.
And then active listening, which is not just hearing the words, but understanding the feelings behind them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it reminds me of this story about Theodore Roosevelt, who would prepare for meetings by researching his guests' interests beforehand.
Wow.
Because he wanted to have genuine, engaging conversations with them
Wow.
and make them feel valued.
That takes effort.
Yeah, it does, but it clearly pays off in building those strong connections.
That's really cool. So it's like you're showing them that you value their time and their perspective.
Exactly.
Which is a great way, I think, to kind of set the stage for maybe navigating disagreements, which
Right.
let's face it, are inevitable.
They are.
So how do we handle those gracefully?
Well, Carnegie's advice is to avoid arguments whenever possible.
Okay.
Because they rarely lead to anything productive, and they often just damage relationships.
It's true.
So instead of trying to win an argument, focus on understanding and finding common ground.
That's good advice. And he even says, never bluntly say, you're wrong.
Right.
Which is so tempting sometimes.
It is.
But he says it's like throwing fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
So what do we do instead?
Well, try acknowledging the possibility that you might be wrong.
Okay.
You know, suggest looking at the facts together, express a willingness to learn from the other person's perspective.
So it's like disagreeing respectfully.
Yes.
And focusing on solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a valuable skill.
It is.
Especially today when it feels like everybody's just digging into their own side.
Right. It reminds us that we can have different opinions without becoming enemies. Finding common ground is essential.
Okay, so speaking of kind of professional skill, Carnegie talks about this thing he calls the Socratic method of persuasion.
Oh, yeah.
Which sounds very intimidating.
It does sound a little intimidating.
Yeah, but I think it's actually simpler than it sounds.
Yeah.
So essentially it's about leading somebody to your conclusion through carefully crafted questions and getting them to say yes early on to kind of build momentum.
Yes, because once someone publicly states no, they become emotionally invested in defending it.
Right.
Even if they have doubts,
Yeah.
it's about saving face.
Totally.
So instead of forcing your ideas on someone, you're guiding them towards the conclusion themselves.
That's fascinating. And he tells this story about Colonel House, who is this advisor to President Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
And apparently Colonel House was very good at kind of subtly planting ideas and leading Wilson to believe that they were his own.
Very clever.
Right. It's brilliant, but also kind of sneaky.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that influence is often about finesse and not force.
Yes.
You know, understanding human psychology and using it ethically to guide others towards a shared outcome.
And I think this next principle we're going to talk about might just be the most powerful one of all. It's empathy.
Empathy.
Oh.
Yeah, I can already see how that ties into everything we've been talking about so far.
Right.
Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, trying to see things from their perspective, seems crucial for all these communication skills.
Exactly. Carnegie says that seeing things from the other person's point of view is key for building rapport, resolving conflict, fostering genuine understanding.
So it's not even necessarily about agreeing with them.
Right.
It's about understanding where they're coming from.
Exactly.
And he tells this great story in the book about an elevator repairman named Jay Mangum. And Mangum needed to convince this hotel manager to shut down an elevator for repairs. But the manager was understandably worried about disrupting the guests.
Yeah, of course.
But instead of arguing with the manager, Mangum just empathized with his concerns.
Yeah.
You know, acknowledged his need to keep the guests happy, and then explained how delaying the repairs would actually cause a bigger inconvenience in the long run.
Yeah.
And by tapping into empathy, he got the manager on board.
That's a great example.
So it's not about manipulation.
Right.
It's about understanding the other person's motivations and finding a solution that works for everybody.
Exactly. And, you know, this applies even in situations where we're feeling frustrated with someone.
Right.
Before we react negatively, Carnegie suggests that we pause and consider why that person might be acting the way they are. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they're dealing with something we don't know about.
Yeah. It's like giving people the benefit of the doubt, remembering that everybody's fighting their own battles.
Exactly.
Okay. I love that.
Yeah.
All right. So on to another interesting concept here, setting high expectations.
Okay.
So how does this tie into winning friends and influencing people?
Well, Carnegie says that people often rise to meet the expectations we set for them, especially when those expectations are framed positively. It's about believing in their potential and communicating that belief in a way that inspires them.
Yeah, like that story about Ruth Hopkins, the teacher who had this challenging student named Tommy.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of just seeing him as a troublemaker,
Right.
she told him, you know, I've heard you're a natural leader. I'm counting on you to help make our class the best.
Yeah.
And his behavior totally changed.
It's amazing how powerful that is.
It is.
You know, by expressing her belief in his leadership abilities, she created this positive expectation that he strived to live up to.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
If we believe in someone, they're more likely to believe in themselves.
Exactly.
That reminds me of that story about Dr. Fitzhugh, the dentist, who noticed that his office cleaner's work was slipping.
Okay.
And instead of criticizing her, He praised her diligence,
Yeah.
but then subtly hinted that she might need extra time to make sure everything was spotless.
I love that.
And her work improved dramatically.
Wow.
And she didn't even have to work overtime.
That's great.
It's amazing the power of framing expectations in a way that empowers rather than discourages.
Absolutely.
So it's not about setting unrealistic demands.
Right.
It's about inspiring people to reach their full potential,
Exactly.
believing in them even when they might not believe in themselves.
Yeah, I love that.
This is really cool stuff.
It is.
It feels like each of these principles kind of builds on the last one,
It does.
creating this framework for just better, more meaningful interactions. So empathy, setting high expectations, these seemingly simple concepts,
Right.
but they can have a really profound impact on our relationships and our ability to influence the world around us.
Absolutely. And speaking of influence, there's one more really powerful principle that we need to talk about.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's this final piece of the puzzle?
Well, it's what he calls arousing an eager want. Basically, it's about understanding what motivates people and tapping into those desires to influence their actions.
Okay, so that sounds a little bit manipulative. How is that different from, like, just using people to get what you want?
Well, it's not about manipulation. It's about framing your requests in a way that aligns with the other person's needs and goals.
Yeah.
Remember, Carnegie's whole philosophy is built on genuine connection and respect.
Okay, so instead of trying to, like, force someone to do something they don't want to do,
Right.
you're finding a way to make them want to do it.
Exactly. Think about it. People are much more likely to act when they feel like they're getting something out of it, whether it's tangible or emotional.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do we actually do this? How do we figure out what people want and then use that to motivate them?
Well, it starts with understanding human psychology. What are those fundamental drives that motivate people? Things like the desire for recognition, security, connection, self-improvement.
Okay, so let's say I want to motivate my team to hit a deadline.
Mm.
Instead of just being like, get this done or else,
Right.
I could frame it in a way that appeals to their desire for achievement or maybe even security. Like, hey, if we hit this deadline, it secures our next big project and everybody's bonuses.
Exactly. You're tapping into their inherent desire for success and stability.
Okay.
Or let's say you want to convince a friend to try a new restaurant instead of just saying, come on, it'll be fun. You could appeal to their curiosity by saying, I heard they have this incredible dish that's unlike anything you've ever tasted before.
So it's about understanding what makes people tick
Mm-hmm.
and then tailoring your message to resonate with those underlying desires.
Exactly.
That's really powerful stuff.
Yeah.
It feels like we've gone way beyond just like surface level communication tips here. We're talking about like a whole new way of approaching human interaction.
That's the brilliance of Carnegie's work. It's not just about tricks or techniques. It's about understanding human nature and using that understanding to build stronger, more meaningful relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into how to win friends and influence people, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the core message is that winning friends and influencing people isn't about manipulation or control. It's about genuine connection and respect and understanding. It's about making people feel valued, heard, and inspired.
And that's something that we can all do,
Right.
right? It doesn't require any special skills or talents.
Right.
It's just about shifting our mindset and approaching our interactions with a little more intention and empathy.
Exactly. Start by focusing on those small acts of kindness and appreciation. Ask more questions, listen more attentively, look for opportunities to make people feel good about themselves.
And remember, these principles apply to every aspect of our lives, from our personal relationships to our professional interactions to even our interactions with strangers.
Absolutely. So go out there and put these principles into practice. You might be surprised by the positive impact you can have on the world around you.